Today's webinar is focused on what to include in a report about findings from an evaluation or impact study. In this webinar, we're paying particular attention to the information you want to be sure to include to support evidence reviews by the What Works Clearinghouse, or WWC, which is the Department of Education's central source for scientific evidence. We are going to emphasize the information you need to include so as to ensure that the WWC will be able to assign the appropriate evidence rating to your study. We recognize that when you write up your evaluation report, you may write a different report for different audiences with varying format and or tone. And although the WWC is not your only audience, it is an important audience for researchers who are conducting studies of the effectiveness of educational interventions, as many of you are. A WWC rating functions as an official assessment of how confident people should be about the evidence you are reporting. And within the Department of Education, the WWC evidence rating is a key metric that is used when there is a funding decision that involves an assessment of the amount of prior evidence there is on an intervention's effectiveness. Two of us will share the presentation today. I'm Barbara Goodson, and the other presenter will be Ann Wolf. Both of us are members of the First in the World TA team from Apt Associates. There's a little bit of a description of our backgrounds in case you want to know any more about us, but Ann will be following me in some of the later slides. The main objective of this webinar is to provide recommendations on what information should be included in an impact report in order to support a What Works Clearinghouse review of the strength of the evidence being described. And that is what most of the slides in this webinar are about. The webinar is intended to help set you up to prepare a report that includes all of the key information, not only your statistical findings, but also important details about the design and analysis. We are focusing on this because we want to help ensure that you get full credit for all the work you did in designing and implementing a rigorous study. That is, you get the highest rating that your study has the potential to receive. If some key information is not included, this could result in a failure for the study to receive the highest WWC evidence rating it has the potential to receive, and could even result in the study being assessed as failing to meet WWC standards. In either case, this could limit the contribution your study could make to the field, and by including all of the necessary information, you can minimize any misinterpretation during the review process. Also, providing complete information will help you avoid author queries from the WWC that they send out asking for additional information during a review that is necessary to determine a study's rating. The reason you want to try and avoid author queries is that they can be time-consuming for the study authors and may delay the completion of the review. These queries may also come unexpectedly long after the project has ended, and sometimes it is not convenient for you to answer them or have the time to address them. And so that is another reason to try and get all of the correct information into your report that you can. In the rest of this webinar, we're going to focus on these four major topics about what you want to include in your impact report. We'll also spend a bit of time at the end of the webinar telling you about helping you learn about additional resources you can access to support you in reporting findings that might provide more detail than this webinar does about specific ways that WWC uses information in its review process. Sorry. We want you to think of this webinar as providing a checklist for your reporting. That is, you can use this webinar to review each section of your report and whether you have included all of the relevant information. We are going to go into detail about 6 categories of information you need to include in your report. These categories are what to include about describing the intervention, what to include about describing the comparison condition, what you want to include describing the study design as implemented, what measures you use both for outcomes and baseline, your analytic approach, and then, of course, the findings themselves. And again, at the end, we will also go into these additional resources to help you for all of these topics. we're going to start with what we recommend that you report about the intervention to help you get an accurate and complete review. So the first thing we want to be sure you talk about is the intervention program itself and what are the key activities that define that intervention. And that includes things like the content of the activities, the method of delivery, the intensity and duration of the intervention, any resources that are provided as part of the intervention, and training and coaching for intervention participants. If you provide this information, it should be able to give the reader a good idea of what actually is being assessed in the impact study. It is also important that you make clear who the participants and settings were in this particular study of the intervention. And that includes the eligibility criteria for participation, the setting and location where the intervention study took place, and the characteristics, idea what kind of schools were in the study, what kind of districts, what kind of students, and when the intervention took place, that is the time period when the study happened. If you report all of these details, it is likely that you will have enough information for the WWC to do its intended review. In addition to talking about the intervention group, you also need to provide important information about the comparison group. And the reason this information is important is so the reader understands what exactly is the contrast that has been studied. How different are the intervention and comparison groups, and in what ways are they different? So you would start by describing what the business as usual services were that the students got, or if you're studying your intervention against an alternative intervention, what that alternative intervention consists of. At the same time, you also want to be clear what services were withheld or not made available to the comparison group. Again, all of this together will make it clear the differences between the treatment group and the comparison group and what exactly the effects represent. By providing this information, you not only help you help any reader interpret the meaning of the impacts at the end. And although this is often not used in a final evidence rating, it is important information to help people understand what your evidence rating means and what the study was about. Next, we're going to turn to what you should report about the study design, and Anne is going to take over from here.
Hi, everyone. So as Barbara mentioned, next we're going to focus on what to report about the study design. You should provide clear and detailed information about the design of the study as it was implemented or conducted in the field. You know, you've maybe already written about the evaluation design when you were planning the design, but in the report you're going to describe the design as it actually was implemented. So first you're going to begin with describing the method of assignment, whether assignment was random, like a randomized controlled trial or RCT, or whether assignment was non-random, like a quasi-experimental design, or QED. For RCTs, you'll want to provide information about how random assignment was conducted, including who conducted the random assignment and how it was done without influencing or knowing the outcome. You want to report the probability of assignment to each condition and whether all units were randomized at the same time or on a rolling basis. Also, it's important to describe any post-random assignment exclusions from the sample. And finally, for cluster RCTs, you need to make clear the timing of when the student sample was identified relative to the randomization of clusters. For QEDs, you need to describe how the individuals and or the clusters gained access to the intervention, how and when units were selected for the treatment and comparison conditions. You need to describe the matching methods that were used to select the comparison group if they were used, and identify the baseline characteristics that were used for matching. Next, you'll also want to describe the unit of assignment. Your report should indicate whether individuals, for example, students, or clusters, for example, schools or teachers or classes, were assigned to the treatment or comparison group. Another aspect of the study design that you should describe is whether blocking was used as part of the assignment process. So blocking refers to grouping or pairing individuals or clusters prior to assigning them to the intervention or comparison condition. And this grouping or pairing is based on a shared characteristic or set of characteristics that are likely to be related to outcome measures. So in a design that uses blocking, the units are assigned to treatment or comparison conditions within those groups or pairs within the blocks. And this approach ensures that the treatment and comparison groups are balanced on the characteristics that are used to define the block. So you're able to ensure that whatever these characteristics are that might be related to outcomes are balanced across the groups. So when you're describing your study design, be sure to describe the blocks if they're used. So for example, if students are assigned to conditions within schools, then schools are the blocks. And if that happens for multiple cohorts, then you have blocks that are defined by cohorts and schools. Okay, I'm sorry. So then another thing that you, another thing that you need to be sure to describe about blocking is in the situation of RCTs. When randomization, when random assignment is conducted within blocks, that is within schools or cohorts, it's important to state the probabilities that were used to assign units to the treatment or comparison condition within those blocks, because this is something that may be important when it comes to how the analysis was conducted, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about the analytic approach. Okay, next, we're going to talk about information that you need to report about outcome measures and baseline measures, including face validity, reliability, over-alignment, and consistency of data collection. So your report should clearly identify each outcome measure and each baseline measure used in the evaluation, whether they're standardized or not, and whether they were modified for the evaluation. For reliability, you should provide a reliability statistic for each non-standardized measure. So for most scale scores from surveys or from direct assessments, internal consistency or test-retest reliability are appropriate measures of reliability. For observational measures, inter-rater reliability is appropriate. The data on reliability that you report can come from your own study. You can calculate reliability using your own study sample, or it can come from reliability reported in prior research studies. For face validity, you should provide information about the content of the measure that you're using in order to show that it is measuring the intended construct. In addition, you should provide evidence that the measure is not over-aligned with the intervention, specifically that the treatment group does not have an unfair advantage using that measure through practice or prior exposure to the outcome measure as part of the intervention. If they did have this exposure, then any positive effects seen at outcome measurement could be the result of the experience with the measure that was obtained through the intervention rather than the effect of the intervention itself. Last, you should provide evidence that the methodology for data collection was consistent across the intervention and comparison conditions in terms of the method of data collection. So for example, were data collected through in-person assessment or phone surveys or online questionnaires, and those methods should be the same in both conditions, as well as consistency of the timing of data collection and who collected the data should be consistent across both conditions. The next set of slides focuses on information that you should report about the analytic approach, specifically the statistical models, the approach to handling missing data, and the approach to establishing baseline equivalence. The report should describe the analysis model that was used to estimate impacts. So for example, whether it was linear regression or logistic regression, multi-level modeling, ANOVA or ANCOVA. And ideally, you should report the equation itself, the Greek model that was used to assess impacts. You should provide information about whether the model adjusts for clustering in cluster assignment studies. You should describe the method that was used to account for clustering, like, for example, multi-level modeling or a Huber-White sandwich estimator or generalized estimating equations. Because if there's no evidence in the report that the analysis adjusted for clustering, then the WWC will apply a post hoc clustering correction themselves. If the units assigned to the treatment group and the comparison group were assigned within blocks or strata, you should describe whether and how the analysis accounted for that blocking or stratification. For example, by including dummy variables for blocks or estimating impacts separately for blocks and averaging those impact estimates across the blocks. This is particularly important if there are unequal numbers of treatment and comparison units across blocks, either by design or because of attrition or missing data. And most of all, this is important for RCTs because the WWC requires that the analysis adjust for differences in assignment ratios, assignment to the treatment group and the comparison group, if those differ across the blocks. That has to be accounted for in an RCT in order for the study to meet WWC. Similar to adjustments for blocking, any other weighting that is a part of the analysis, such as using propensity score weights or non-response weights in the analysis, should also be described. And finally, you should also describe what, if any, pre-intervention measures were statistically controlled for in the impact models. So particularly whether the model controlled for the baseline or pre-intervention measure of the outcome variable or any other baseline variables that are required to establish baseline. Okay, let's look at an example of how a study might report its analysis model. Providing an actual equation or Greek model is an efficient shorthand for describing how the impact estimates were calculated and what adjustments were included. So in this example, the model is a multi-level model that adjusts for clustering in this cluster design. The treatment variable is included in the level 2 equation to represent treatment and comparison course sections. There's a set of dummy variables to represent blocking of course sections by cohort. And the model controls for baseline student characteristics, including the baseline measures that are required to establish baseline equivalence. Another important aspect of the analytic approach that you need to describe is the handling of missing data. Whether missing data are imputed or not imputed. And if data are imputed, you'll need to describe how and for what measures. The report should provide information on the methods that were used to deal with missing data in outcomes, in baseline measures, and other control variables. The WWC accepted methods for imputing missing data include regression imputation, maximum likelihood, non-response weights, and for RCTs, but not other designs, the dummy variable adjustment. Previously, under the version 3.0 WWC standards, imputing missing data was only accepted for RCTs with low attrition. For QEDs, RCTs with high attrition, and cluster RCTs with bias from entering individuals, complete case analysis was the only acceptable approach for handling missing data. Now, under the new version 4.0 standards, it still is true that complete case analysis is always considered an acceptable approach by the WWC. However, under the new version 4 standards, imputation of missing data may now be accepted for other group designs besides not just RCTs with low attrition, but also QEDs, RCTs with high attrition, and cluster RCTs with risk of bias from entering individuals. They may accept imputation of missing data if they determine that the risk of bias from missing data imputation is limited. I'm not going to go through how they make that determination, but if you want to find out more information about analyses with missing data, you can refer to the WWC Standards Handbook version 4. But again, I just want to reiterate that even under the new standards, it's still true that complete case analysis is always considered an acceptable approach by the WWC. Okay, so now what to report about the baseline equivalence model. The report should state whether the baseline mean difference between the treatment group and the comparison group is calculated as just a simple difference between the unadjusted means for the treatment group and the comparison group, or whether the analysis used a statistical model to reflect the design, the assignment strategies, like a statistical model that accounts for blocking or the unit of assignment. That's another approach that you can use to calculate the baseline mean difference, and in fact, we recommend that you do so, that you calculate the baseline mean difference using a modified version of the impact analysis model with the baseline measure as the dependent variable, and then model adjustments for assignment strategies like blocking and clustering. If the model-based approach is used, then you'll need to report the same information about the baseline model as the information reported about the impact analysis model, including providing the equation. You'll need to describe any adjustments included in the model, adjustments for unequal allocation in random assignment, adjustments for blocking, for weighting, and or adjustments for clustering. For more information about establishing baseline equivalence, you can see a guidance document that has just recently been posted on the TA website that goes into a lot more detail about how to establish baseline equivalence and calculate the baseline difference. Okay, in the next set of slides, we discuss what to report about findings from the evaluation, noting where there are any differences in what to report depending on the study design. So we'll start with what to report about impacts, and the information that you need to report about impacts is the same for both RCTs and QEDs. For each outcome, it's necessary to report the sample size information for both the treatment condition and the comparison condition. So that's the number of students in the treatment group and comparison group, and for a cluster design, also the number of clusters in the treatment group and the comparison. You need to report the means for the comparison group and the treatment group on the outcome measures. We recommend that you report the unadjusted sample mean for the comparison group and the model adjusted mean for the treatment group, which is the sum of the comparison group mean and the treatment coefficient from your impact analysis model. Also, for continuously scaled outcome measures, it's necessary to report the standard deviation for the outcome for each condition. This information is used to calculate the pooled standard deviation, which is then used to standardize the treatment effect. For binary or dichotomous outcome measures, like, for example, retention or graduation, the standard deviation is not applicable and you don't need to report it. In addition, you should report the treatment effect, which is the treatment comparison difference in means at post-test. The unstandardized treatment effect, or the impact estimate, is the coefficient from the treatment variable in the impact model. And you should also report the exact p-value for the test of the treatment effect from a two-tailed test. If all of this information is reported, then the standardized effect size can be calculated by the WWC. And then one thing I just want to add is that if you do use imputed missing outcome data or impute missing baseline data for a design other than an RCT with low attrition, you may need to provide some additional information beyond what we've covered here, because the WWC will need to assess whether there's bias from missing data. So you can refer to the WWC Standards Handbook version 4 to find out more information about how they assess that bias from missing data and what additional information you might need to report if you have imputed data for a design other than an RCT with low attrition. Okay, this table shows an example of how impacts can be reported. The table reports for 2 outcomes the number of the number of schools in the treatment group and the comparison group, the sample size of clusters in the design, as well as the number of students in the treatment group and in the comparison group. The table includes the unadjusted comparison group mean, the standard deviations for both the treatment group and the comparison group. It includes the treatment comparison difference in outcomes, which is the impact estimate. That's the parameter estimate from the treatment indicator in the model. The table includes the adjusted treatment group mean, which is the sum of the comparison group mean and the impact estimate. The table includes the standard error of the impact estimate and the p-value from the test of the effect of the impact. And also in this table, the standardized effect size is included, which is calculated by dividing the treatment comparison difference by the pooled standard deviation. Okay, the next set of slides focuses on attrition, what to report about sample sizes so that overall and differential attrition rates can be calculated. Information about attrition is only needed for RCTs, not for an RCT in which individuals are randomly assigned. It's necessary to report the number of individuals randomly assigned to each condition and the number of individuals in the analytic sample in each condition. Then this information can be used to calculate the attrition rate. So the attrition rate is the percentage of randomized students who are not included in the impact analysis. And attrition is calculated overall for the full sample, and also the difference between the attrition rates in the treatment group and in the comparison group will be calculated. And this is the differential. For cluster RCTs, you need to report the number of clusters that are randomly assigned to each condition and the number that are in the analytic sample in each condition. In addition, you need to report the number of students in both the randomly assigned sample and in the analytic sample. And also note for cluster studies, the count of students that you need to report, you only need to include the students in non-attrited clusters. So if a school drops out of the study, the loss of the students from that school will not be counted as part of the student attrition, but only counted as part of the cluster attrition. So the WWC uses all this information on sample sizes to calculate attrition rates. And here's an example of a table that reports the necessary sample size information to calculate overall and differential student attrition rates. The table includes the number of individuals that were randomized. In this example, it's a student RCT, so just students were randomly assigned. And then the number of individuals in the analytic sample, in the comparison group, and in the treatment group. Most evaluation reports will not only report these sample sizes, but will also calculate and report attrition rates. However, as long as this sample size information that's here is in the report, then the WWC can calculate the attrition rates, even if they're not reported. And here's an example of a table that reports the necessary sample size information to calculate cluster attrition rates and student attrition rates for a cluster RCT. The table includes the number of clusters randomly assigned to each condition and the number of clusters in the analytic sample in each condition, the number of students in non-attrited clusters that were randomized to each condition, even though in this example, none of the clusters attrited, and then the number of students in the analytic sample by condition. Again, most evaluation reports will include the attrition rates, but just this sample size information is sufficient, even if attrition rates are not. Okay, the next set of slides focuses on reporting findings about baseline equivalence, including the designs for which you should report baseline equivalence, what information to report, and an example of how to report those findings. So not all designs have to report data on baseline equivalence. However, it is necessary for QEDs and for some RCTs. We can walk through designs one at a time. So beginning with RCTs with student assignment. If they have low attrition, it's not necessary to establish baseline equivalence. But it is necessary to establish baseline equivalence if attrition of students is high. For cluster RCTs, if they have low cluster attrition, low student attrition, and do not have any risk of bias from entering individuals, in other words, the sample either includes no joiners or includes only joiners that are allowed according to the WWC for that topic area, then it is not necessary to establish baseline equivalence. But it is necessary to establish baseline equivalence for a cluster RCT if cluster attrition is high. And one thing I want to point out is that for cluster assignment studies that have to establish baseline equivalence, they can do so either for the students in the analytic sample or for the clusters in the sample. Either approach is acceptable. It's also necessary to establish baseline equivalence for a cluster RCT if student attrition is high, even if cluster attrition is low. And it's necessary to do so to establish baseline equivalence if attrition is low, but there's a risk of bias from entering individuals in the cluster RCT. So if the sample includes joiners that are not allowed according to the WWC, then it is necessary to establish baseline equivalence. Although in this particular case, for this situation, it would be possible for the study not to establish baseline equivalence, but to show evidence of representativeness, which we'll talk about in a little bit. That would be an alternative to baseline equivalence for that one design. Okay, and then it's always necessary to establish baseline equivalence for QEDs, those with assignment of students and those with assignment of clusters. Okay, now that we've gone through when you need to establish baseline equivalence, we can go over what to report about baseline equivalence. For each of the measures that you use to establish baseline equivalence, for each analytic sample, you need to report the number of individuals in the analytic sample for the treatment group and for the comparison group. These sample sizes for the treatment group and comparison group should exactly match the sample sizes that you have included in the impact analysis. And then again, if you have a cluster design and you're establishing baseline equivalence using means for the clusters, then instead of reporting the number of individuals, you would report the number of treatment clusters and the number of comparisons in the analytics. Okay, you also need to report the unadjusted baseline mean for the comparison group and the model adjusted baseline mean for the treatment group if you used a model-based approach to calculate the baseline difference. If the baseline difference is not estimated using a model, then you can just report the unadjusted baseline mean for both the comparison group and we'll need to report standard deviations of the baseline measure for the treatment group and the comparison group for continuous measures. Again, for binary or dichotomous I'm sorry, it says outcome measures on the slide, but it should say baseline measures. Then the standard deviation is not applicable, so you do not need to report standard deviations. And that might be a binary measure. Baseline measure might be Pell Grant eligible. Finally, you need to report the baseline mean difference. The unstandardized mean difference is the coefficient for the treatment dummy variable from the baseline model, if a model was used to calculate the baseline difference, or if a model was not used, then it's simply the difference between the unadjusted mean for the treatment group and the comparison. If all of this information is reported, then the standardized effect size at baseline can be calculated by the WWC. However, you probably will want to calculate the baseline effect size yourself to determine whether the groups were equivalent, and of course you can do that. The standardized mean difference at baseline, the effect size, is the baseline mean difference converted into standard deviation units using Hedges G for continuously scaled measures. That's just dividing the baseline mean difference by the pooled standard deviation, or by using the Cox index for binary or dichotomous measures. If you want to get, again, more information about how to calculate the standardized baseline mean differences, you can see the guide on establishing baseline equivalence that was recently posted on the TA website. And finally, as I noted previously, if you impute missing data for your outcomes and or for your baseline measures for studies other than RCTs with low attrition, you may need to provide some additional information beyond what we've just covered. So again, for more information about analyses that use missing data, see the WWC version 4 handbook. And then here's a table that presents data on student-level baseline equivalence for 3 measures. For each measure, the table reports the number of students in the treatment group and the comparison group, the unadjusted sample mean for the comparison group, standard deviations for both the treatment group and the comparison group, the difference in the treatment and comparison means, and the adjusted mean for the treatment group, and the standardized difference or effect size at baseline. Last, we're going to talk about representativeness, which is relevant for some cluster assignment designs. We'll focus on how to provide evidence that the number of individuals contributing to analyses is large enough to be considered representative of the clusters in the sample. The WWC may assess representativeness, which is a measure similar to non-response rate. Representativeness is defined as the proportion of individuals present in clusters who are in the study sample, but what the WWC looks at is the proportion that are of individuals present in the clusters who are not in the study sample to determine if there's a concern. Okay, so again, information on representativeness is only required for some cluster designs. When it is required, sometimes it is enough to provide the information for the post-test sample only, but other times it's necessary to provide this information for both the post-test sample and the baseline. So we'll go through this, this is by design. Okay, so it's not necessary to establish representativeness for QEDs that have student assignment. It's not necessary at post-test or pre. And the same is true for RCTs with student assignment. Data on representativeness are not needed at post-test or pre-test. And really, for any student assignment design, it's never, that's a rule, it's never necessary to provide information on representativeness. For QEDs with cluster assignment that establish that the students in the analytic sample are equivalent at baseline, they do not have to provide evidence of representativeness. But if the baseline equivalence, which is written on the slide is Q for baseline equivalence, if the baseline equivalence of individuals in the sample is not established, Then data on representativeness must be reported both for the post-test sample and for the baseline sample. For RCTs with cluster assignment, if they establish the equivalence of the students in the analytic sample, then again, they do not have to provide evidence of representativeness. And that's, again, a general rule that you can remember. Like, if it's never necessary to provide evidence of representativeness when you provide evidence that the treatment and comparison students are equivalent. Okay, but if baseline equivalence of students is not established, and you have a cluster RCT with high cluster attrition, then you need to establish representativeness at post-test and for the baseline. If cluster attrition is low, but there's a risk of bias from entering individuals, in other words, there are joiners in the sample that are not allowed by the WWC, then data on representativeness should be reported for the post-test sample, but it's not necessary for the baseline. And the same is the case if there's high student attrition for cluster RCT. Data on representativeness should be reported for the post-test sample, but it's not necessary for the baseline sample. Okay. So now that we've talked about when it's necessary to report information on representativeness, now we'll go over what information needs to be reported if representativeness is required. So you will need to provide information about the sample size. If you have to report representativeness for the post-test sample, you'll need to report the number of individuals that contribute to the post-test means in each condition. And actually, these numbers are the same as the number of individuals that you've previously indicated are in the analytic sample. So it's the same sample that you've reported when you've reported impact. But if you have to report information about representativeness for the baseline sample sizes, you'll report the number of individuals that contribute data to the assessment of baseline equivalence, the treatment and comparison cluster. The baseline sample sizes may not be the same as the post-test sample sizes because the individuals contributing to the baseline equivalence assessment may not be the same individuals as those that were included in the impact. In addition, you need to provide information about the number of individuals present in clusters for the intervention and comparison group. You need to report the total number of individuals present in treatment and comparison clusters at the time that outcomes were, if you're assessing representativeness for the post-test sample. For example, for schools, you would report the total enrollment in treatment and comparison schools when outcomes were measured. For studies that have to report representativeness at baseline, you would report the total number of individuals present in the treatment and comparison clusters at the time that the baseline was measured. So again, because the baseline and outcome measures are collected at different times, often with an interval of a year or more, the number of individuals present in the clusters may be different at those two time points. That's why you need to report the number enrolled at each time. You will need to report the date that the post-test was measured for the intervention and comparison groups, and also for baseline if you're reporting representativeness for the baseline sample, and the date when post-test enrollment was measured the date when the post-test enrollment was measured, or when baseline enrollment was measured if you need to report representativeness. Okay, here is an example data table that shows the information you need to report for the assessment of representativeness at post-test. The data includes the number of students in the clusters in the analytic sample for the treatment and comparison group, and the number of students present in clusters at the time of outcome measurement. You report the time that the outcome was administered and the timing that enrollment was measured. the timing that these two counts are measured doesn't have to be precisely aligned. So outcomes could be measured at the end of the year, and enrollment may be measured at some point during that school year. And as was the case for attrition, this sample size information is sufficient for the WWC to calculate representativeness rates, regardless of whether you calculate and report representativeness. So representativeness is calculated just like attrition is. It's the percentage of students enrolled in clusters who do not contribute to the post-test or baseline mean. Like attrition, it's calculated for the full sample overall, and the difference in the treatment and comparison rates is calculated as the differential rate. So the overall and differential non-response rates are compared to the WWC's attrition thresholds to determine if the representativeness standard is met or not. And so that is everything that you need to include in a report for a WWC review. Next, Barbara is going to let you know about some additional resources that are available about reporting, and she'll start taking your questions.
Hi, sorry, hi again. So we wanted to be sure you understood that in addition to the information covered in this webinar, we're going to point you to some other existing resources to help you when you're thinking about your reporting and your final reports on an intervention study. These include resources provided by the WWC itself, as well as resources on the IES Evaluation TA website. In terms of what the WWC itself provides, there is a reporting guide for study authors, which is a short document that also includes an outline for an impact report, which would be very similar to the information presented here, and again is a very good resource for you to use when you're putting together your report to make sure you have all the correct sections and all the correct information. There are also the WWC handbooks, which include both a standards handbook and a procedures handbook. In version 4.0, these two are separated. Up till this point, the WWC has put standards and procedures in the same handbook, and now they're separated. And so particularly, you want to look at pages 36 to 46 and Appendix B if your analyses use imputed data, because this is one of the places where version 4.0 includes some different standards and guidance than 3.0. In some ways, they have relaxed the rules slightly for when you can use imputed data, but there's additional information you need to provide, and it's really important that if you're going to use imputed data, you understand what the rules would be under 4.0. So we direct you to these particular pages in the standards handbook, and the procedures handbook explains more about the actual review process itself. Very helpful resources. In addition, as we've talked about before, the WWC has created review protocols that cover different intervention topics, and most people are doing intervention reports and interventions that align with one of the review protocols. And in those protocols, there is helpful information about issues specific to that topic area in terms of reporting rules, baseline measures, what they want to know about the population in the study. And so it's very good practice to consult a relevant review protocol as you're doing your reporting. Finally, there are also copies of the WWC study review guide and instructions, which would help you understand exactly how a review would happen with your report. You could sort of mimic what a review might look like, which might help you identify pieces of information that are missing from your impact report. So the WWC itself has provided really a wealth of information to help you in your reporting to try and reduce the number of reports that they get asked to review that they have to do author queries or end up with a rating that the author thinks is not as high as their study had the potential to receive. In addition, there are other resources outside of what the WWC has produced and already available on the Evaluation TA website two different websites. One is the First in the World website, which is what the first link is here, and the second link is for an evaluation TA website that is supported by IES that is relevant across different grant programs. Already on the IES website is the evaluation design plan template that you were encouraged to use in describing your evaluation plans, and the contrast tool. Also, some of the guidance that has been produced, and you may or may not have seen during the First in the World grant program, include reporting study findings to support evidence reviews, which is the guidance document that aligns with this webinar, a guidance document on established baseline equivalence, and a guidance document on specifying analysis models and group design evaluations. The specifying analysis models there are webinars that are aligned with each of these guides. The one today aligns with the reporting guidance, and there will be a webinar upcoming before the end of December on the impact analysis models and baseline equivalence.